Evolution goes on. The animal shape capable of sheltering the spirit, capable of allowing it to develop, is found. From now on, everything takes place as if the next step could only be realized progressively, by abandoning on the way the scaffolding which has become useless as a result of the emergence of more perfect forms, evolving slowly toward ultimate and still distant perfection. Though it is not always apparent, the memory of the intermediate stages in living beings often persists, like the traces of gills still visible in the human embryo. Not only does physical memory persist, and by physical memory we mean the anatomical structures slowly built up and transmitted hereditarily, but also the memory of the instincts accumulated in the brain, which at a given time in evolution corresponded to conditions of existence determined by the environment. It is against this heredity, against this immense accumulation of memories, by now deprived of any meaning and dating back to epochs forever vanished, that man must fight to prepare the advent of the spiritual being he is destined to become. Evolution continues in our time, no longer on the physiological or anatomical plane, but on the spiritual and moral plane. We are at the dawn of a new phase of evolution, and the violent eddies due to this change in the order of things still conceal that fact from the eyes of the majority. The transition from the ancestral animal, still squirming within us, to man is too recent for us to be able to understand the ensuing conflicts, which often seem disconcerting and incomprehensible. We are incapable of realizing it, but we are actually living in the midst of a revolution on the scale of evolution. In comparison, the social revolutions we witness, even if they cost hundreds of thousands of human lives, are but tragic children's games, and will leave no trace in the future. After having for thousands of centuries blindly obeyed inexorable laws, a certain group of living beings differentiates itself biologically from the others and is confronted with new obligations. New orders are imposed, all of them contradicting the preceding ones, and restraining the realm of man's joys, of his physical pleasures. How is it possible for him not to revolt against this authority, which he does not yet know but intuitively respects? Like a wild horse which reacts against the bit, but differing from the animal inasmuch as he himself imposes the check, while remaining free to reject or accept it, man finally becomes truly master of his destiny. It is from this mastery, based on the liberty to choose between the satisfaction of the appetites and fight towards spirituality, that human dignity is born. True human personality appeared from the moment speech was developed. Even though morphological evolution continued, animal intelligence, instincts, began to give way to a very different and specifically human form of intelligence. The still distant goal, namely the separation of man from the animal, necessitated a new phase, destined to last for centuries. The first indication of the new orientation of man was given by the ancient artifacts, the coarse flint implements and the traces of fires. However, other proofs of humanization were soon found, and in our opinion these proofs were much more impressive. They were the sepulchres. Not only does the Neanderthal man bury his dead, but he sometimes unites them, as in the sepulchre of the Children's Grotto near Menton, France. This is no longer a question of instinct. It is already the dawn of human thought, manifesting itself by a kind of revolt against death. And revolt against death implies lasting love of those who have gone, and the hope that their departure is not final. These, quote, ideas, the first perhaps, are seen to develop side by side with aesthetic sentiments. Flat stones are piled up or propped against each other so as to protect the faces and heads of the dead. Later on, ornaments, weapons, food, pigments for coloring the body accompany the deceased. The idea of finality is unbearable. The dead will awake and be hungry. They will have to defend themselves. They will want to adorn themselves. The dead are not dead. The fact that they live in the memory of those who loved them, who admired them, leads in man, and in man alone, to an idea which expands beyond the sentimental realm of the individual. He projects this idea outside of himself, and creates a new objective existence for the departed. This is something entirely unforeseen. He knows that he will never see the loved ones again on this earth, but he refuses to believe that they cannot live somewhere else. So he invents another life. He creates another world in which someday they will meet again. Thus, without too great an effort of imagination, we can conceive that the care of the dead, the combination in man of one of the oldest characteristics of living beings, memory, and of a sentiment widespread in all superior animals, love, gave birth to the specifically human notion of a beyond. Man takes advantage of all the traits inherited from his ancestors, but transforms them into new tools which hasten his own evolution. Memory, which is the essential condition for the persistence of living beings, existed in the most rudimentary animals. Some biologists affirm that proofs of it have been found in monocellular organisms, in paramecium. This much is certain. Evolution could not have taken place without it. The character which first differentiated animals from plants, and gave the former an immediate superiority, may have been memory. It alone is capable of building up conditioned reflexes and instincts. However, it is probable that the mechanisms of this memory differed from those which act in individuals endowed with a centralizing brain. Irritability, a characteristic of living matter, is, one may say, the substratum of memory. The development of memory does not, therefore, any more than instinct, require localization in an evolved brain. The instincts of insects are more remarkable than those of the mammals. Yet the mammals have a more complex brain and are more intelligent, that is, more capable of successfully facing unexpected circumstances. The insect is a prisoner of his instinct. The intelligence of mammals expresses the greater liberty acquired through their evolution. Not only are they protected by certain hereditary instincts, but they have the ability to devise new methods of defense against numerous unforeseen events encountered in the course of migrations, or resulting from changes due to the convulsions of a world in formation, to meteors, and to dangers of all kinds. Man, the new being, hardly freed from the ancient chrysalis, enjoyed far greater degrees of liberty than the other mammals. They were possible only in him, and were sometimes the consequence of anatomical improvements, closely connected with one another. The development and specialization of the hand imposed an upright position. It may have been only a trial like the others, but this trial was immediately crowned with such success that two immense gains followed, tools and fire. Articulate speech, which depends partly on the structure of the lower jaw, the protruding chin, must have come later. Thereafter the road is clear, the goal is set. Man leaps ahead. Henceforth his path separates from that of the rest of living beings, which he will always dominate. Evolution will continue through him alone, and will tend increasingly to make the two roads diverge. It is by this ever greater divergence that we must from now on measure the progress of evolution. However, man cannot liberate himself all at once. The weight of heredity, which goes back hundreds of millions of years, is too heavy. His own strictly human curve of evolution is only drawn progressively, and not without hesitation. Fluctuations eventually manifest themselves by individual or collective regressions, which bring him back to the animal. How could it be otherwise? The physico-chemical mechanisms at the base of his structure and of his functions are essentially the same as those of other mammals. His body obeys the same laws. His brain carries all the hopes of the new species, but is made up of cells like those of more primitive beings. These cells are nourished like the others, and their functions are ordained by the chemical products secreted by the endocrine glands which direct and maintain the harmonious equilibrium of the whole. The thyroid gland controls intelligence, and its suppression or its atrophy transforms the normal being into an idiot. But the gray cells of an idiot and those of a man of genius seem to be identical. The parathyroids partly control the nervous system. The pituitary gland controls bone growth. Its ablation brings death within a few days, just as the removal of the suprarenal glands brings death within a few hours. Finally, the interstitial glands exert an all-powerful influence over the development of certain male characters, such as the voice and the hair. When they are injured, the brain, the heart, the muscles, the skin are affected. Furthermore, moral and physical energy, the specific male qualities, are directly dependent on them. Thus, the very foundation of the human organism is material, chemical, the same as that of the animals. It must eat, sleep, procreate. It is difficult for man to evade this relationship, to free himself from the endocrine enslavement. By fighting against it, he will affirm the difference to which he owes his human dignity, and by ceding to it, he will abdicate the independence gained by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. At a certain period of his metamorphosis, man became conscious of this fundamental dualism, which is in reality the eternal theme of religions, philosophies, and arts. The awakening of this idea constitutes the most important event in all evolution. Up till then, like all the living beings before him, he did not have to intervene in the external phenomena which directed his progressive improvement. He was an irresponsible, unconscious, intermediary link in a chain. He only reacted through the irritability of his tissues and obeyed the appetites inherited from the superior animals, although he was freer than the latter. His greater intelligence, his hands capable of shaping flints and lighting fires, his larynx, apt to emit sounds that his tongue and lips could model endlessly, enabled him to control his fate, and henceforth he had the choice between a return to animality, to slavery, and the pursuit of his role in evolution. Up to the birth of conscience, the being who was to become man only differed from his ancestors morphologically. He was subject to the laws of nature, to the laws of evolution. He had to obey, and that was right. The moment he asked himself the question as to whether an act was good or whether another was better, he acquired a liberty denied to the animals. The more or less romanced explanation of this fact is of no importance. It matters little whether it is attributed to the family or the clan, to the reprisals of parents or of neighbors. The truth is that in man and in man alone, the possibility of this choice has been transformed into a moral idea, whereas this is not the case in any other species. The new orientation of his evolution was clearly indicated. Henceforth, contrary to all the others, in order to evolve, he must no longer obey nature. He must criticize and control his desires, which were previously the only law. The purely human conflict is born from this permanent, bitter struggle, which has lost none of its violence today. Unquestionably, when considering the majority of men, it is possible to doubt the reality of the moral idea. The examples we see daily enable the pessimist to ask himself if the chasm between the animal and man is as deep as we thought. The answer is that we are still at the dawn of human evolution, and that if only one man out of 1,000,000 were endowed with a conscience, this would suffice to prove that a new degree of liberty had appeared. Many important steps in the history of evolution started out as a mutation, affecting only a very small number of individuals, perhaps only one. Similarly, the moral idea must have been sparsely distributed, and was, in fact, so fragile that instead of conferring a physical superiority upon those who harbored it, it constituted rather a hindrance. Indeed, at the time of the caveman, sentimentalism, pity, fairness, charity, all the budding qualities highly valued today in mankind, must have been a serious handicap to those who had to face the unconscious cruelty and brutality of the others. Such conflicts are not infrequent in our time. However, on an average, and in spite of their weaknesses and subjection to ancestral instincts, the masses are responsive to the great virtues, which have always enjoyed a surprising prestige, even though they were not practiced. Today, when large groups of men fail to react as we think they should, when there is no collective response, there are nevertheless many individuals who, without being themselves exceptionally virtuous, without having martyr souls, spontaneously revolt and sometimes end by carrying away the crowd. The history of humanity abounds in such examples, and evokes the picture of a climbing vine. If its prop is pulled up or broken, the plant creeps along the ground, unknowingly seeking a new support, another occasion to raise itself above the weeds. And as soon as it is found one, it clings to it in an unconscious but untiring effort towards the light. It is sometimes mistaken. Its choice may be bad. The branch it has adopted may be rotten. That is not their fault. The human flock obeys an obscure order. It must rise, and it cannot do so without a leader. Thank God, if there have been evil influences, they have been counteracted, on an average, by that of certain rare, privileged men, comparable to the transitional animals who were in advance of their time. These men attained a higher stage of evolution, and had a great part to play, a high duty to fulfill, namely, to orient the march of humanity in the path which leads away from the animal. Strange to say, in spite of their handicaps, of the fact that the doctrine they taught was less pleasant and demanded sacrifice, it is they who gained the higher prestige in history, and their teachings outlasted and outshone all the others. This new liberty given to man was necessary in order that evolution could continue. When the physical support, the human body, reached a state of relative perfection, new trials became useless, and evolution had to continue on another plane, essentially human, the spiritual plane. Now, how can such an evolution be conceived without the constant collaboration of man himself? As we have seen, innumerable trials were made during the course of evolution. Confronted with nature, these trials were sometimes crowned with success, in which case the new species prospered. At other times they were a failure, and the species vegetated or disappeared, but a trial on the biological plane, anatomical or physiological, transforms itself into a test on the psychological plane. In the latter case, it is no longer just a question of surviving. A superior level is attained. It is a question of progressing psychologically and morally. As in the past, progress can only take place by struggle, competition, and selection. To understand this first step towards the reconciliation of science and religion, we shall be obliged to define the meaning of certain words with care, particularly the words liberty and order, or command. In the preceding pages, we pointed out that liberty could be considered as a criterion of evolution. We showed that as we rise in the scale of living beings, there is a proportional increase in liberty. It is evident that this criterion only takes place in its full import with the birth of conscience, and that this last liberty could only be bestowed on a being already physically freer than the others. But in spite of this greater freedom, he remains equally subject to the demands of the body, which is, as we have already pointed out, composed of elements similar to those of the other animals. Biologically, therefore, man remains an animal. Later on, we shall see that this was necessary, for it is by fighting against his instincts that he humanizes himself. Now, in what does the liberty of the animal consist? It consists in very little. The fish is freer than the coral, or than the starfish. The mammal is freer than the reptile. But from the top to the bottom of the scale, all the animals, without exception, are the slaves of their physiological functions, and of their hormonal endocrine secretions. In no case can they liberate themselves from these any more than from their hereditary instincts, because physiological functions, endocrine secretions, and instincts are the direct and inevitable consequence of their very structure. This structure, itself a consequence of evolution, was willed. Animals are, therefore, not free, and this is the symbolical meaning of Genesis, when it says that God ordered them to live, to grow, and to multiply. It is clear that when God created animals with certain organs, it was equivalent to an order to use them. They therefore have no choice. What they will do is really what they must do. The same command is given by God to the first human couple, male and female, on the 6th day. This might be taken to correspond to the human form, as yet conscienceless. Let us try, although we may be reproached for it by many excellent scientists, to analyze the sacred text as though it were a highly symbolic and cryptic description of scientific truth. This has been done for a number of alchemical works, and has revealed that some alchemists were really much farther advanced in chemistry than was thought before. If it does not lead us anywhere, it can do no harm. So let us read Genesis very carefully. On the 8th day, God creates another living being, having the human form also. And for the first time, the sacred text uses a different language. God first breathes in the soul through man's nostrils, and then commands him not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, knowing that he will eat it. What does this mysterious language signify? It signifies that the most important event of evolution has taken place. It signifies that the appearance of a new discontinuity in nature, a discontinuity as deep as that which exists between inert matter and organized life. It signifies the birth of conscience and of the last freedom. Indeed, God could not have forbidden anything to the animals without contradicting himself. Having built them in a certain way, having subjected them from the very start to biological laws imposed by their structure, he could not go back on his orders without a major reason. namely, the conscience bestowed on this new animal, which was required for his further evolution, and which none of the preceding ones possessed. Now this is precisely indicated by the fact that God, quote, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul, which may be taken as signifying that he gave him, and him alone, a conscience, that is to say, the liberty of choice. From then on, God can forbid this creature to obey certain intransgressible orders given to all the others, the physiological orders, the animal instincts. He can do this because this new being is free, which signifies that his endocrine bondage can cease if he wishes. Man henceforth has the choice either of obeying the orders of the flesh, and consequently of rejoining his animal ancestors, of regressing, or else, on the contrary, of struggling against these impulsions, these animal instincts, and of affirming the dignity he won when he acquired the last and highest liberty. If he chooses to play the part of man at the price of physical suffering and privations, he leaves the animal behind. He progresses as a man. He continues evolution in the moral plane, and is on the road which will eventually lead him to the spiritual plane. The text of Genesis, extraordinarily condensed, thus becomes comprehensible and rich in meaning. Unless we interpret it in this way, it is obscure. Certainly, an interdiction is also an order, a negative one, but it implies something more, namely freedom. Indeed, when a criminal is in prison, one does not forbid him to go out, nor to commit other crimes. It is materially impossible for him to do so. But when he leaves his prison, one can forbid him to continue his criminal activities, because now he is free to do so. The error was not to have understood that God, who created and willed living beings, does not express his orders by words, but by physical, absolute impossibility. One might as well say that an engineer who constructs a carburetor orders it to furnish the motor with explosive gases. It would be impossible to forbid the carburetor to play its part. If it is in good condition, it cannot help vaporizing gasoline as soon as the motor aspirates. But the engineer can forbid a person, if that person has free access to the car, to press on the starter. The importance attributed by the sacred text to this event, the fact that it develops it and in reality makes it the first human event, the fact that, in spite of his disobedience, this guilty man is chosen as the founder of the human line, proves the henceforth preponderant importance of the liberty of choice. In spite of the interdiction, man disobeys and commits the original sin from which humanity must eternally wash itself. This cannot signify an arbitrary punishment imposed on all the descendants of man. It signifies that the actual human being has not yet attained the degree of perfection he must reach. He did not pass the test. He is still dominated by his ancestral instincts, and he disobeys God by obeying them. It signifies that every man will be confronted with the same dilemma, that every man will have to face the same conflict, and that he will only triumph by crushing the animal impulses within himself, and by consecrating himself to the triumph of the Spirit. Thus he will fulfill his mission as a man, and will contribute to the divine plan which tends to produce a spiritually perfect being. Human progress, therefore, no longer depends solely on God, but on the effort made by each man individually. By giving man liberty and conscience, God abdicated a part of his omnipotence in favor of his creature, and this represents the spark of God in man. Liberty is real, for God himself refused to trammel it. It is necessary, for without it, man cannot progress, cannot evolve. The animal struggle against nature, against the elements, and against the enemy, the struggle for life, from which the human form finally emerged after 10 million centuries, is transformed into a struggle of man against the remains of the animal within him. But from now on, because of his conscience, it is the individual alone who counts and no longer the species. He will prove that he is the forerunner of the future race, the ancestor of the spiritually perfect man, of which Christ was, in a sense, the premature example, by emerging victorious from the fight. Thus Christ can be assimilated to one of the intermediary transitional forms, perhaps 1,000,000 years in advance of evolution, who came amongst us to keep us from despair, and to prove to us that our efforts can and must succeed. He in truth died for us, for had he not been crucified, he would not have been convinced. Consequently, any restriction to liberty of conscience is contrary to the great law of evolution, that is, to the divine will, and represents evil. If certain individuals made bad use of their freedom, so much the worse for them. The test was unfavorable. They were not evolved enough to understand. As far as they are concerned, the trial was a failure. In nature, chance favors a small number of eggs out of the hundreds of thousands laid by one fish. As it is impossible to distinguish one egg from another, it does not matter which one survives. In mankind, the individual is no longer indiscernible, and each being has an equal chance to qualify as an element of moral evolution. If man does not seize this chance, if he does not understand intuitively or rationally the significance of his decision, it denotes that he was not fitted to play his part. Others will assume the responsibility of assuring the ascendant march of evolution. We must, therefore, instruct men, and not blindfold them under the pretext that society will lead them by the hand and guide them. Nobody has the right to substitute his own conscience for that of another, for progress depends on personal effort, and to suppress this effort constitutes a crime. The whole will of man must be concentrated on this struggle, in which he is upheld by the newly acquired sense of his human dignity, from which he must draw at the same time the necessary strength and the proof of his high destiny. It is in the intensity of this effort, and not in its form nor in its result, that the true degree of humanization is revealed. The immediate conclusion is that liberty of conscience can manifest itself constructively only if the individual has access to all sources of information. If he is free to exert his judgment without hindrance, this is equivalent to the confrontation of a new animal species with its environment, the test of adaptation. He must, therefore, be equally free to gather the elements which he deems necessary for the formation of his judgment. From the strict point of view of Genesis, it is inexcusable for a strange will to substitute itself for his and to effectuate a preliminary choice capable of influencing him. So that his judgment may be healthy and undeformed, man must be free to cultivate his faculty of reasoning and to instruct himself. Those who need to be guided are not quite free. They must be enlightened and not compelled. For the Church, the effort of man is motivated by the redemption of the original sin which was permitted by God, whereas for us it is made necessary by the survival in man of the ancestral memories, against which he alone can fight. As the original sin was nothing but the animal obedience to appetites, and the disregard of human dignity, the similarity is striking. Thus man bears a part of responsibility in evolution. His free choice will act very much as natural selection has done so far. It is he who must now make the choice which will orient his individual destiny and that of the species in the direction of progress. But how can his action manifest itself? How can he contribute to evolution while resisting the natural solicitations, or temptations in the language of the Scriptures, which yesterday still were the only ones he knew, the only imperative ones? How will the fittest, who is not necessarily the strongest, nor the most agile, nor the most resistant, be able to play his part? He will play his part with the help of a new factor of evolution, which was introduced at the same time as speech, namely, tradition.